welcome to Shacknews E4 Day 1 coverage here. We are very happy to have two folks from V1 Interactive working on Disintegration, which I'm going to have you folks describe this game because I find it difficult to describe it myself. It's very, it's a shooter? No, I don't know. It's something. We have Joe Arroyo and Marcus Leto here. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome to the Shacknews E4 celebration of video games. We really appreciate you folks joining us.
Hey there, and thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You folks are releasing a game. Disintegration is coming out June 19th on multiple platforms, right? Can you just explain to the folks at home what Disintegration is?
I am going to give this one to Joe because Joe has he's been there since the very beginning making this game, and the two of us have been working on this game for several years, and I'm actually curious to hear Joe's take on this one because you're right. It is it's a challenging game to describe in a single sentence or two. It's one of those games you really do want to experience. I've given my spin on it 100 times. I'd love to hear Joe's.
Yeah, I've prepared a statement for the... No, Disintegration, it is a shooter at its core.
Yeah.
But it's a shooter mixed with real-time tactic elements where you pilot a grav cycle, which is basically like a flying motorcycle-esque with weapons equipped on it, both support, offensive, defensive sorts of things. And you also give orders to a set of AI units on the ground at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your buddies.
Yeah. You can. It's much more pingy, like point and click style. Everything feels like shooting. Like even when you give an order, you're kind of firing off an order to attack this enemy or go to this position, and you give them sort of like to the whole crew at once. Similar to like controlling a hero in a MOBA, but you're actually giving one order to your whole squad at the time. And then each squad member is actually equipped with a unique ability that you can fire off that's specific to each member. And that's where the game really like gets its legs, is you have the opportunity to trigger those at the right moments, and they create really great combat feel moments when you kind of do the right ones in the right order all at the same time and fight like a large number of enemies all at once.
Yeah, I feel like there's two battles going on in your game. There's like the ground battle and there's the air battle or the floating battle, whatever you want to call it. And there's times where, me and another operator, we're fighting in the air with each other. Or there's another time where I'm trying to take out their team on the ground, and there's this interesting meta where your attention in this game is so much more, it's just different than a shooter, because you have to be mindful of whatever objective you're doing with your team versus, I have to watch if I'm being flanked right now. There's like I think it's very cerebral in that sense.
Yeah, that's at the core of the game. That's what we were shooting for. I think we've described it a handful of times like this, where the grav cycle and your onboard weapons, both offensive and defensive abilities that you have on board, are just one part of that equation. And the other major part of the equation is your ground crew, like Joe was just describing a little bit ago, each of whom have a unique ability that can be used tactically in the midst of combat. And it is so essential that you wrap your head around those two components being the single thing that makes up an effective crew. And it takes about, we'd say we usually see about 10-15 minutes for players to go through a couple matches, and then they start to understand, not only do I have this aerial flight maneuverability with the grav cycle and this fantastic, ability to just move through the environment fluidly, but I also have this ground crew that, if used effectively, can be absolutely devastating. Especially then when you team up with other team members in the midst of a multiplayer match. So it's something that we were real excited about when we first started prototyping this game idea, and it's taken us so long. We went through so many iteration phases. Joe can attest to this, being the forefront of those changes mostly in boiling it down to just the essentials, where we didn't want to add too much complexity to it because we don't want to overwhelm the player with asking them to do too much. Get it down to its essentials, the stuff that really matters with the kind of game that we're making, and make sure that the player feels like they have that kind of tactical maneuverability in the midst of combat then as a result.
You know, you're talking about iteration. I'm curious, you know, you've done some betas for the multiplayer testing. Can you talk about some of the things you learned during that time that you're able to bring to that? And then also maybe from your past experience in the Halo franchise, some multiplayer best practices that you think you've been able to iterate upon, or at least look to for inspiration when it comes to balancing this game. Because it's very different when compared to like a traditional shooter, but you still have matchmaking elements and a team composition and things that I think are really interesting. See if you can speak to that.
Sure. I mean, for some parts of the game, you know, we look at past game reference, both from what I did with Halo and then many of the other games that are out there these days, as far as how matchmaking and how we can team up players and how we can you know, just like move the players through that entire experience into multiplayer. But it really did require us to go through and invent, you know, all new mechanics for how we're like making the core gameplay mechanics for the game work in general, and that loop that we put the player through. Joe, you can really describe, I think, a lot of the feedback we got from the community, and how much of it we absorbed and then integrated into our final approach for the game.
Yeah, we did. We listened to a lot of the feedback that came in, and a lot of it did get addressed. Probably one of the biggest, maybe it's the hardest thing to grasp initially when you play the game in terms of it clicking together, is how effective your ground units actually are. They're very effective. And it's easy to forget about them. And sometimes when people play the game a lot more like it's just a dogfight, they'll get killed really fast and wonder why sometimes. And so we were trying to work on better ways to communicate like how you're getting hurt and things like that, so that you can better understand when you see it like occur that it was actually one of the ground units that pilot that you were fighting against actually outsmarted you, because they did a good job of placing their units maybe on the opposite side, underneath and behind you while you fought. And you didn't think to do that because they were in follow mode and you were just thinking about the fight in front of you. And what can happen there is it can become either a learning experience where you realize what was done and how you can get on the other side of it, or a very frustrating experience where you wonder why you just got melted when you feel like you can't melt the enemy when you're fighting. And so it really is about just teaching them, like, use your units. They're really effective when you use them.
It's funny because I definitely had that aha moment when I was playing the multiplayer beta, you know, like months ago or whatever on PS4, and I was like, I heard them screaming because they got destroyed by the other team, and I was like, wait a second, my boys are gone, you know. And like, once you have that realization that you are in this, you're in a vehicle, but you can protect this team, and you are like, you kind of start to really be mindful of where they are relative to you, and you move together. It really changes. Like I said, it becomes a much more cerebral game, and I think people are conditioned to just spawning and dying in COD, and that they're like, wait, I have to think.
Yeah, I mean, people want that feeling of, I got the drop on you, that means I should have won this fight.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not how our game works. It doesn't work that way. The only thing you get when you get a drop on somebody is you get one more decision before they get to you. Everything past that point is whether or not you make the right choices during that fight, which is explicitly why you can't just melt another grab cycle really easily in one-on-one combat, because the person who used the concussion grenade from their warrior and then their slow field to stop that small frame grab cycle from escaping, and then finished off with one of their weapons, that's how you can quickly kill an enemy grav cycle, not by just firing all of your bullets into it.
And speaking of like the efficiency matter, like and the learning factor here, would you say that like as players learn the game, like is there like a definite path to a 1-2 punch that will sort of become their standard engagement tool, or is this the kind of game that you've built to like basically allow players to build their own strategy, build their own 1-2 punch, so to speak?
Joe, as the technical design director on this game, you were key in building these systems. So I think that you should answer that one.
I think we did spend a lot of time trying to create those scenarios where you can give them the uppercut moment. It's just it's not from charging a weapon and letting it out. Like it's from timing this ability, and that the moment it hits, you're ready to do the thing that best suits that. Certain crews are more well equipped for that scenario, but other ones are completely best utilized to destroy other ground units. So crews like the warheads that have these trinades that shoot out on the ground, they can damage other enemy grav cycles, but it's much more effective to spam those into all of the ground units on the enemy team. I mean, there's something really powerful about some of the multiplayer modes, because regardless of the fact that you're in the air doing these dogfights, all of the objectives for the most part are unit controlled. So in your zone control, a unit has to take it. For retrieval, a unit has to pick it up. So no matter what, because you've got your right arm is your grav cycle, your left arm is your unit, and you're one cohesive entity, if someone cuts off your arm, there's one piece, a whole half of what you do in the game is taken away from you. And using that to your advantage as well is really important. So there are ways to be effective in the game without even doing the uppercut move at all. So it really depends on how you like to play. Some people want to be the grav cycle killer, and other people, the one that's going to clean up all the units on the ground. For every unit you take out, you remove one of their abilities, at least temporarily, right? So knowing that I'm going to, shoot that destroyer first, because those destroyer seeker rockets are really nasty. I know that I just took that away from that player for at least a handful of seconds during that fight. That's a big play. It's a cerebral play that you may not see, but the player it's an instant satisfaction if you start to understand those mechanics.
Yeah, because then like when you're playing multiplayer and you have a team that's coordinating, like you said, you have one person that's going after ground troops, one person that's going after, or two people are flanking. I feel like you've set up a lot of the levels, a lot of the maps to have these moments. They're really interesting moments that happen, like at corners of turns, or like I'll be coming around something and there's like three dudes there, and I'm like, oh god, or being able to get the jump on someone in your game. It's not that it's like, I feel like every FPS is about flanking, right? But when you have flying vehicles and people on the ground, the concept of flanking becomes really interesting.
Right, because who's doing the flanking?
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
it the units?
Right.
Is it the grav
Sometimes
cycle?
it is the units. Sometimes it's the grav cycle. And it's also real important to realize the team comp as well. Like each one of the crews, plays a loose role in combat. So some crews, like Joe was describing, are great at clearing ground units. Some are best used at holding back and pinging away at the perimeter, but also used to support and healing your other teammates, and you're not just their grab cycles, but those ground units. Like when in one of our retrieval modes, when one of the ground units picks up the core and is running to the core, if you're effective at healing that ground unit along its way, because it's the primary target for everybody on the opposing team, you can get that core runner into the home base effectively by doing that, and if you are really working as a team together.
As a concrete example of the opposing side, kind of to touch on what TJ was asking, is that play. If you were playing sideshows in that same scenario on the defense, on the defensive side, you have a slow field. You have 2 slow fields from your rangers on the ground, and then you also have a ground slam from the Rhino, and you've got sticky grenades that you can detonate when you want to. If you think about how those can combine, when a core carrier is trying to run it up, whether they're getting healed or not, hitting them with a slow field that stops them in their tracks, lighting up that whole area with sticky grenades, and pairing that with a Rhino's ground slam all at the same moment, you're just going to wipe every unit in that spot. So it would be in that person's best interest on offense to maybe just focus down that sideshows and get them out of the equation. They're going to stop that thing to the platform.
That's true.
Speaking to the ground troops gameplay, kind of a question like about third-person tactical shooters. Like, you know, we've seen XCOM style games be really popular, like turn-based style games. This is the way it's. How would you describe this? It's like real time, but with some kind of RTS elements. Like, because like you said, there's different attacks you can do with the different characters on the ground. There's different strategies. There's different modes, like you said, like the retrieval one. How do you describe that gameplay when compared to like other third-person shooters? Right? There's like the games like the Division. There's even like where Ghost Recon has gone versus like what SOCOM was and what XCOM is. How would you describe that gameplay to someone who hasn't played Disintegration yet?
I would put it in that our entire focus was making sure that the gameplay experience was as fluid as possible throughout. That we didn't have the hiccup or the break in gameplay with any kind of turn-based mechanics or pausing of making tactical choices. That we wanted the player to be able to do these things fluidly in the midst of normal first-person shooter combat. So that definitely meant, as I was mentioning earlier, boiling down the way that we do that and the things that we give the player. So that's why you only have 2 to 4 ground units each as each player and each crew. And we do that on purpose, so we don't want to make sure that you are overwhelmed with an entire army worth of units on the ground that you each have to micromanage, because we wanted to pull all of that micromanagement out of it. And that allows us then to make those quick movements in that first-person fluid shooter kind of way. Joe, I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
I mean, if we're talking about trying to maybe explain just what the core loop might feel like to a player that's maybe first approaching the game, and the best that I can think of is, I mean, imagine you are playing a MOBA where your hero character is actually just more than one character on the ground, and you give them commands to attack that or go here, all of the type of pinging, clicking you would do there, and to tell them to use one of their abilities that are on usually pretty short cooldowns. That type of feeling overall, but put you actually in there where you're not just some god in the sky, you're actually a participant in combat, and you have onboard weapons as well. That's having that all together at once.
Yeah, I think MOBA is actually a very good comparison. It's like obviously very different genre, but that feel even on. No, I could see that. I think that's useful to people who are looking at this like, what, it's not necessarily going to be like an XCOM game, right? This is a way more fluid, real-time experience, and I think like some people may look at just gameplay and see the wrong thing. I think it's important to describe it properly like that.
And it wasn't our goal to be like, hey, can we make a MOBA shooter? It really was more like we actually started out as an RTS, but a long time ago. Once we put ourselves into combat, we realized we had to pull things back, and like Marcus said, it required a lot of simplification, because if you can't just like mash 2 games together and expect it, really to work if you're not willing to take the best parts of each or the parts that complement each other the most. And that means small subsections of, tactical elements and subsections of a shooter in order to pull off like a good, healthy mix between the two that's fun to play.
So, this just came to my mind because I remember seeing this. You folks had a pretty sizable booth presence at PAX West last year. You had a big old hover bike, right?
The graph cycle.
Yeah, the graph cycle.
Yeah.
Where is it right now? Is it your house?
It can't even fit in our office.
No, it can't. Our office, we've grown to about 30 people in the office, and that's about as many.
That thing was huge.
Yeah, I think it's in a storehouse in Texas right now.
Okay, but it's safe.
It is safe.
Yeah.
And we're waiting to see what office it does end up in when we have room for it somewhere.
Look, as long as we get the ping pong table back before the graph cycle, then
okay. Priorities. Yes, I get it. Yes.
I mean, I think ping pong table's about 6 feet. I think that's socially distant. That should be okay.
I mean, we did talk about if we could sort of mount the monitors properly, then Marcus could just get into the graph cycle, sit in all the way, and just do work every day there.
That's
we could
my
take his desk out, and he could just be in the middle of the office, just sitting in the graph cycle all the time.
Well, when you folks reopen, you have some high quality problems to deal with. It sounds like.
It does sound like it, yes.
I kind of want to talk about a little different topic: sound design in the game and the soundtrack for the game. You talk about where the inspiration for that came from and who you worked with on that, because I think it's a super important aspect of a game like this, and even in the single player versus the multiplayer, you guys got a pretty nice soundtrack there.
Thanks. Yeah, the music in the game was a collaboration with a composer. His name's John Everest. He's a local Seattle composer, and that we've been working with him. We brought him in about 1.5 years after we had begun production on the game to start working on composing the audio soundtrack for the game. Both the dynamic music that you hear throughout the game, Joe can probably talk more about how that all works, but that was something that we took quite a long time, iterating on to make sure that we got that right. And then he's also composing much of the music that we hear outside of the game as well. Soundtrack should be available soon, I hope.
Okay. As for audio design, Jack Menhorn did so much of of everything that you hear in the game, and he spent a lot of tireless effort putting things together to really communicate. And I think that was a really important thing, was every little feature that we did, it was very important to him to make sure that the audio complements it, but even more importantly is not the standalone reason why you are aware of that feature. If that makes sense. To avoid any accessibility problems or anything where we're dependent on audio to tell this, to tell you what this is or how this works. But one of the biggest benefits that we had was, I would say, the unit chatter system might be one of my favorites in the game, and how well that actually played out, and all of the pieces that had to come into play from the technical side and from Jack's side, and from the writers, everything that we had to do to put that together so that they're saying meaningful things. They're saying meaningful things in combat, especially in single player, that help you understand what's going on at any given time. And we put a lot of the storytelling effort into those sections as well. So much leverage there to be able to tell large portions of the story, especially as a small studio that can't, cram a bunch of cinematics in everywhere, to be able to let the story unfold as you play it when the characters are talking back and forth.
Yeah, which is actually one of those things that we prefer, honestly, because it's more organic, and it definitely allows the player to kind of discover the story on their own pace as they're running through the missions themselves. So yeah, like Joe said, like he's been fantastic as our audio sound designer for the game and handling systems like that. And he's your quintessential, like, really into audio design. Like, he's the guy who's walking around the neighborhood with the microphone always out, capturing something somewhere that's going to inspire him and us when it comes to new sounds and new audioscape for the game.
That's awesome. No, I think it shows. Like, there's an attention to detail. I'm glad you brought up single player. Not every shooter ships a single player anymore, or a campaign, or a story. A lot of them are just, let's play multiplayer.
Yeah, I'm excited to buck that trend.
So, at what point did you decide to do that? Was this game a multiplayer game first that you decided to tell a story, or did you have a story that you were like, hey, this game's fun, let's make it multiplayer too?
I started working for the fiction on this game over 6 years ago.
Okay.
And when Joe came on board to start helping build a prototype for it, it was a single player only focused game. It wasn't until we had honed in on some of those core gameplay mechanics that we realized the multiplayer potential of the game, and cautiously tread into that territory, with understanding that it would be no small task to tackle a multiplayer component in addition to the single player component. And it's interesting too, Asif, because we've been working on the single player side of the game, and that has been our priority for many years. And then we shifted focus over to like embrace multiplayer equally. But it was multiplayer was the only thing that the public saw for some time, and just assumed that we were a multiplayer only game. So we were real happy earlier this year to start talking about the single player side of things, and realized that we have just as much passion about that as anything else on the multiplayer side of things. Because in the single player realm, it's like that's where the story lives. That's where like all of the lore of the universe lives, and it gives legitimacy to everything that lives in the world. And that carries over into multiplayer, and it just makes the game such a richer experience as a result.
I think that was very true of the Halo franchise in its origins, and I think that's maybe something that the franchise doesn't have in its whatever iteration it's at now. But like a lot of games are just straight up not even shipping with single player, because like you said, the dev work to have a multiplayer game that works well and plays well and is fun is so much. It's like it's a lot easier to ship something that doesn't have to deal with netcode, right? So that was a big decision. Like, when was that decision made, and like, how do you feel about it? Because that must have added time. Like you said 6 years from when you came up with the concept of this universe. When was that decision to really add multiplayer made? Because it feels like you said, all the times that I've seen this game out in the world, it's always been multiplayer. So I find that really interesting. Like, when was that moment that you folks decided to make this push?
Yeah, Joe, when was that? Because it was before Greenlight. I mean, we had it was in our major presentation to our publisher, Private Division. We had a slide or two in there for the multiplayer component. It was much smaller in scope though at that time. But yeah, exactly when
it was more the scope, I think, that grew more so than whether we flipped a switch to do it.
Sure.
During the Unity prototype days when we originally were working on it with just 3 people, just getting a feel for whether this could be something interesting that we could explore if we were to get a publisher on board. Right as soon as we started working with Private Division and switched to Unreal and sort of started the project that you see today, that was when netcode started, regardless of whether we were going to for sure do it or how big it was going to be. Because one of the worst things you can try to do from a technical aspect is just add networking after the fact. It's kind of the equivalent of saying you moved in all the furniture in your house and then you decided to buy an area rug. It's that moment of like lifting up the couch with your leg and the chair with your arm, and like it's not fun for any engineer. So it was important to us from the very beginning to just be like, every little feature we make, can we make sure that it supports networking? A little bit of time that we put in advance now, especially with how small we are as a team, it was kind of imperative, and it was something that was a firm pillar sort of regardless of how it turned out. I think what happened was, because we did that from the beginning and it started to flesh out, we were able to see the picture quicker, and that's why the scope started sort of getting larger for the multiplayer aspect.
Got it. So it was like a snowball rolling down a hill kind of scenario.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a nice big wet snowball that kept taking way more snow than we thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like one of those.
I am curious, like, you obviously have like this fleshed out multiplayer experience you're working on, this fleshed out single player experience you're working on. Is there a lot of like, are these completely standalone sets, or is there any interplay between them? Like, if I'm a pure multiplayer guy, what's to push me, like, outside of gaining knowledge by playing single player, what's to push me to go back and like actually play through the single player? And on the flip side, if I'm playing single player and I just want to play for the story, what's the push for me to go and see what it's about over there on the PvP side?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so on the multiplayer side, like if you are a multiplayer only, like that's your jam, then what the kind of things that might bring you into the single player campaign might be some of the special features that don't exist in multiplayer at all. Such as when you stage unit abilities in multiplayer, it's an immediate thing, and you have to do it real time, which is what we're all used to doing. But in campaign, we dilate time and allow the player to do things that they physically cannot do in multiplayer. And so there's special features like that, as well as then just experiencing the story and the really cool characters and what we can do with advancing those characters and your graph cycle throughout the campaign mission progression. On the flip side of it, if you are a single player only player and you've gone through that campaign, we're hoping then by somewhere through that experience that you've learned the skill set to master that graph cycle and ground unit interplay, and that you can take that into multiplayer and really use that to your advantage in understanding how both of them work together in concert more thoroughly.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask a question just about the single player difficulty range. That there's Outlaw, which is like insanely hard, right? And then there's story mode, right? So there's a more accessible way to play through the game, right? Can you speak to the philosophy of accessibility that you brought to the game? Because I think it's super important for games to be playable by as many people as possible. I think it's cool to see that has been an effort on your part.
Well, you just said it. That's a really important part of what I've really held true to throughout the development of games throughout my entire career, is making sure that we can make games that are accessible to a very wide audience, because we don't want to exclude anybody. So it can be discovered and played through on story mode in a way that really is, it's still a challenging experience, but it's a little bit more forgiving and allows the players to really just soak in the awesome story that we have to tell through the single player campaign. And then if you are really in for a challenge, and like Joe and myself are, and the way we designed the game was to be played on some of the harder difficulty levels, and there's some really fantastic experiences that you'll get out of that as a result that are very different from the story mode. It also helps prepare you for multiplayer a little bit better too.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, because the game's kind of unique in its gameplay, having a single player there instead of just a tutorial is, I think it teaches you how to play the game. Mm-hmm. And then you bring that knowledge that you know from playing single player to the multiplayer, where I think when you just jump into the multiplayer without that knowledge, you have that moment where people are a little confused.
But we do have a tutorial that we strongly encourage players.
Wait, so there's a tutorial, what? You guys are ridiculous.
Yes, we are.
That's absurd.
The tutorial was, it was originally designed to get you prepared for the single player campaign, more than anything. So it's not a tutorial in the sense of like, here are all the multiplayer mechanics and how you play each crew and all of that, but it is more about all of the tools in the toolbox that you're going to use during the single player campaign, so you can get a feel for it in advance. But we did a couple things that we added for after technical beta feedback was a multiplayer sandbox So you can just go into one level, pick any crew you want, and explore them against just a wave spawner, so that you get. So a lot of players would get jumped into combat, pick a crew for the first time, and what do I do with these?
Yeah. So that was actually a real big feature that we added based on feedback from the community that we felt was real important. So in addition to that tutorial that takes you through the basics of just understanding how that grab cycle and the ground units work and firing their abilities and all that, having that multiplayer sandbox is just a great way to, just figure out what crew you might want to main with and what they can do against some AI on the ground. So it's a really great way to just explore the water with each one of the 9 crews that we have to offer.
I kind of want to ask about multiplayer, just from you mentioned you're working with Epic Games, the Unreal Engine, right? Mm-hmm. Crossplay. Is that something that you folks have looked at? Is it something that you talked about? What is your philosophy on crossplay?
We've looked at it. It's technically possible. It's not something that we are currently doing due to agreements between parties, but sure. It's something that it's not it's not impossible for us.
I mean, you're obviously I don't know how to describe. Would you describe yourselves as indies, right? V1.
Yeah. No, we are definitely an indie studio.
Yeah, you're an indie studio.
30 people.
Yeah,
So.
and you're working with Private Division, which is sure a big publisher, but
they're actually not that big. Private Division is also a very small publisher.
But they're part of some big company over there.
They do have great resources available to them, which is fantastic, and it helps us a lot. But across the board, they're a boutique publisher, and we are definitely an indie studio. So using Unreal Engine was a choice we made in order to avoid having to hire, an entire staff of 30 or 40 people just to build an engine from scratch.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and the reason I brought up Epic is that they've really been pushing the envelope when it comes to Epic Online services, which they're making available to devs, and then what they did with Fortnite. You're right, like not everyone can get Sony and Microsoft and Nintendo into a room to agree on anything, but I feel like they kicked the door down for a lot of devs now, and for a shooter game or an online game, I feel like it's good for devs for us to be able to play with each other across platforms.
I would love that too. And it's a matter of time, I think, for that to trickle down to some of the smaller studios and the power that we have.
Yeah, no, but I think it's something that I will champion forever. Like now, like I when we got it in Fortnite, I was like, I want it in Rocket League, and then we got it in Rocket League. I'm like, okay, what next? All of them. Give me Call of Duty. It's like, okay. But I think that's like another secular thing happening in the industry that could be really positive for studios like you and a lot of games out there that, because it's not no fault of anyone other than the platforms. You're locked into is why you don't see many Nintendo Switch FPS games popping on, really, as a result. Like the communities are not as big there. Whereas this game it's on Steam. PC gamers are going to play this game on Steam. There's a lot of people on Steam. So I feel like I can see the platforms where people are going to play this game, but I can tell you that the power of being able to play a game on PS4 with Xbox with Steam is just amazing. And I wish that it would be easier for devs to be able to do that.
Yeah.
From a technical standpoint, it's not always too difficult to pull that off. I mean, most of the implications don't come from whether we can allow players on different platforms to play with each other, because that's really just a server letting in players from various platforms and allowing the game to function. It becomes everything that surrounds that in terms of being able to then have to build your own party system and your own that goes outside of the platform systems of Xbox and PlayStation and Steam. And now you have to build that feature as well internally, which also is highly possible for us. And we're all super, excited about the possibility of doing something like that in the future. It just always comes down to having to plan that work out, and, and find out whether or not we can make that sort of thing happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I do want to ask, speaking of like multi-platform development, and especially with yourselves having worked on games that had competitive elements in the past, you've got these 9 crews in multiplayer, and obviously they can do different things. They can bring different things to the table, whether it's defensive, offensive, support, all that jazz. What kind of challenge has it been to sort of make sure that a meta doesn't arise too soon, to make sure that these nine crews remain competitive, whether it's on a keyboard and mouse being played on PC or a player using a gamepad on a PS4?
Joe?
Well, actually, one of the benefits of the game kind of feeds into sort of what we've talked about previously, which is that getting the drop on someone doesn't get you the victory, and the game's a little more about making the right decisions and outsmarting people. We haven't really felt the weight of mouse keyboard versus controller nearly as heavily as other Twitch shooters would have. And due to that, it kind of, I wouldn't say it's a non-issue, but it is a lot easier to allow. I think our game's a lot more prepared for that type of play, because even if you can aim a little better than me, we don't have headshots on pilots. You're not going to out mouse cursor me nearly as much as it would if I pull off the right abilities. So I think that's one that it just really helps with the possibility of that sort of cross-platform play. In terms of metas are going to arise. I think whenever you put anything out in the wild, you'll just be surprised by what the community can come up with. And I think that's actually our biggest strength would be to watch the community and to be impressed by what they do and figure out ways to listen to them, to make appropriate changes if a meta were to arise. But we do have a great QA team in Vegas with PD, and they do such a good job playing the game a lot, especially the multiplayer. There are we can't beat any of the testers when we play. Not even close. It's always just a wipe. And so they're a lot of QAs about file bugs here and there, but for us it's really important also to get a lot of information from them about how they feel about the game and how they feel about any metas they think are arising, especially the people that play it.
Yeah, and to that point, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a meta that arises that blindsides us or just surprises us in some way. But as a small studio, we can pivot, and we're listening to the community, and we're ready to see how the game will evolve beyond launch. And we're already working on post-launch content. We're already prepared to change course just a little bit here and there, if necessary, to accommodate what happens with the game post-launch.
Talking about playing it, let's say I've already beaten the game. I'm playing the multiplayer, I'm grinding. As I progress, I'm going to rank up, right? What am I getting for this? I need to have some sweet swag of some sort, right? Like, are you guys working on that post-game thing? Like you're talking about, obviously you have some content plans, but for that multiplayer grind, right? What have you...
There will be unlockables for skins, aesthetic skins for your pilots and for your grab cycle crew as well. We are making sure that all new crews, all new maps, all new modes are free to the community, so we do not fracture the community at all.
Nice. Yeah. And now I think our time's almost up. We really appreciate you taking the time out. In a different universe, we probably would have been in LA at a booth talking about this.
That would have been awesome.
Ending by the grab cycle.
Yeah,
yes.
We would have had a photo op with the grab cycle. Like, things would have been great. But here we are. Instead, we pivoted. You pivoted. Can you talk just a little bit of how your team has been working during this period? Like, this is you said you're a small team, but you did have an office. Clearly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, you folks have had to pivot for working from home. Can you talk about that and how the hell did you get this game out? Just congratulations on releasing it. Like, I really
thank you.
We still do have an office. It's collecting dust right now, and it's been almost 14 weeks now that we have been quarantined and working from home as a studio. And it has happened during one of the most challenging phases of closing out the game. As mentioned earlier, we're doing this on 3 platforms. So closing out, like going to certification for the Xbox and PlayStation platforms, as well as wrapping up the Steam version for PC, has been a huge challenge. Joe has been mostly in the thick on the technical side of that as well, because as we get towards the end, it's those last most difficult and challenging bugs that are left remaining, and he's been the lucky recipient of many of them.
Yeah, I would say probably there's one challenge and one benefit, I think, of just the timing of where the game was when this all sort of happened. One of the biggest challenges was trying to go through certification on consoles when a lot of dev kits have to be like IP certified, so we couldn't even take them home for a long period of time before they were approved to be in our home to use as dev kits. That was a challenge because it meant that we had to kind of ignore for a short period of time certain certification bugs on a particular platform for a week, like while we're in this transition. So it was a bit of a, it's the panic of the unknown is a little bit worse than just knowing what you have to do in front of you. And when you've got something that you can't touch for a little while, it's kind of scary as a team. So once we got over that hump though, and we were able to get them distributed to the engineers, I think things smoothed out a lot more because we were able to work on the console features that needed to be done for cert. And then one of the benefits was probably just that game was very, very close, if not completely, on design lock, like right around when the office had to close. So there weren't a lot of decisions that required us to be in big meetings to figure out what feature to do next and then have to plan all those features. I think a lot of that production work would probably be a lot more difficult if there were a lot of them to flesh out left. But instead it was more about the body of work was known, and it was more about finishing all of the things that were in front of us that we knew clearly what we needed to do. And that avoided us from having to have Zoom meetings with 20 faces and everybody trying to chime in as best they can by hitting the raise hand button or whatever. So yeah, it kind of worked out all right because I think everything was right in front of us and everyone just had to do what was, asked of them. That's a testament to our team too, because I think we've always sort of worked that way. That's something that Marcus has done a great job in hiring people that we trust to do their work. That just shows once we weren't in the same office together and everybody still was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to that end, like it was about maybe 2 weeks worth of time where we were trying to figure out the technical things, and we were probably down to 30% efficiency for a frightening amount of time. But that slowly picked up. And, I'm really proud of the team at V1 for being responsible individually at home and really getting into this new groove of working from home and being responsible. And we did it. We actually got through certification. We have we're ready to ship and launch on the 16th of June. So it's crazy. I can't believe we would have done this. This is definitely one for the history books because I've never been through a dev cycle like this ever.
So we do this thing called the Shacknews Awards at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to let you know, we're nominating you for the Do It for Shacknews Award because accomplishing this launch in a pandemic, you deserve at least a nomination, right?
Thank you. Yes.
No, because it's really impressive. And we already work from home. We had a remote office. I do have a physical office that I did evacuate, but there's literally only 2 of us in Ohio, where you got people all over the world that work for Shacknews. So we were kind of prepared for this. but knowing that companies that, you know, have resources and have physical things that can't leave the office unless there's like hearing that story, that's really interesting. And yeah, that must have been really tough to be so close to the end of this project after 6 years of working on it, and then have a freaking pandemic thrown at you.
Yeah, it was a little hurdle, a little bit. This might be one of the few times where our team size actually benefited us in this scenario, because it's a lot easier to keep 30 people in check than it is to be 100, 150 strong trying to put something out and making sure all the wheels are turning.
That's right.
So true.
Just for what platforms is the game coming on, and what does it cost, and when?
So the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Steam on PC, and it's going to be $49.99 and launching June 16th.
So $49.99, that's an interesting price point. That's like a little less than the traditional AAA price. Are you guys saying something like, hey, you know?
What we're saying is that the game is a high quality game. It's got pretty much all the features you'd expect from most AAA games. It's just a slightly smaller form factor, built from a team that is an indie studio of only 30 people. And while we are small, we are incredibly efficient with what we can do together as a team. So that helped us build a product that looks like it was built by a team of 500 instead.
And so, you know, we have Series X coming out later this year, and they have that smart delivery concept. Are you folks looking at smart delivery support or next generation hardware?
We haven't started looking too much at them. Dev kits are on the way, so we will be looking at taking advantage of some of the new tech on the new platforms, and it will be TBD as to what we announce on what we're going to do feature-wise or anything else for those platforms.
So it's almost becoming a meme at Shacknews, but we have to ask this question. Do you think this game could run on Switch? And would it even be worth trying to make it work on Switch?
We've already tried.
Oh.
So there's some things that we're fooling around with, but I think the biggest challenges for us, aside from some perf issues, would be UI design and some of the HUD elements and things that really need to read at a smaller size.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work is downscaling assets to the resolutions for handheld purposes on Switch. It's just a lot of busy work that you folks do not need right now, but it is something that Shacknews definitely has a large PC gamer component to our user base, but oddly enough, most PC gamers also own Switches, so it's this thing where there's a chance you'll get people to double dip if you release on a Switch, maybe down the road. So it was worth asking, but yeah, people are interested. We obviously have these next generation consoles coming down the road, so to hear that you folks are going to be looking into that is also exciting.
In Unreal Engine, there's a button that you can hit that just says build for Switch. So, and that's not a lie. So we've done that. We've hit the button. If that, it may not have gone very well, but
can't tell you what frame rate it ran at.
Yeah, but we pressed that button.
It's right next to the crossplay button, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It is. You got me.
Well, Joe and Marcus, thank you so much for spending your time with us and being here at Shacknews E4. Even though we couldn't hang out physically, we were still able to do it for Shacknews, and our community really appreciates it. We look forward to the game's release. I think by the time this interview goes live, we may have already reviewed the game. I know Sam Chandler is playing it right now. I'm going to be jumping into that multiplayer session this weekend too, so
right on.
I will hit you guys up with some impressions there too. But I played, like I said, I played this on PS4 months ago on controller. I'm excited, to be getting back into it on my PC. And congratulations on the launch, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you. We appreciate you so having us here. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, stay tuned. We got more awesome E4 stuff coming up, apparently.